Thank you very much, Diane, for that very warm welcome to Simon and Jade. Thank you to all of you for coming to hear me speak. My presentation today will interlink aspects of theory and my practice as a historical archaeologist through a Black feminist lens to understand how free and enslaved Black women navigated the plantation economy in the Caribbean. Because my work is inherently interdisciplinary, that is, a foot in history and a foot in archaeology, this talk will seemingly be about two different topics, but trust me, they're not. Still, this may be a bit of a new journey for some of you, but just get comfortable and hopefully you'll enjoy this intellectual ride. For this first section, I'll briefly explore Black foodways and more specifically, daily subsistence practices performed during slavery as a form of transformative culinary resistance for identity formation and for societal change. The second part of my talk considers how free women of color in the urban sectors of island society aspired to social ascension and economic freedom by becoming slaveholders themselves. Unfortunately, I won't have time to go into depth as to why I frame my work in a Black feminist critique and standpoint, but just know that the strategy is used to consider new ways of making African diasporic archaeology and history more engaging to wider audiences and challenges our field to participate in more anti-racist activism. Until recently, studies of slave foodways have relied on primary sources and other forms of textual evidence to conclude that throughout the colonial period in the French Caribbean, slave nourishment was a constant source of confusion and criticism. Overall, there's a general consensus that slave food and the general diet was very problematic. However, I would go further and say that nourishment for the enslaved laborers in the French colonial islands was an arena of multiple conflicts and had been so since the onset of intense colonization. According to primary sources, slaveholders tried to enforce a high caloric diet that included tubers and other complex carbohydrates like manioc, yams, sweet potatoes, guinea corn, rice, things like that, with little nutritional value for the enslaved laborers. Now, in terms of slave alimentation, there were two methods by which they were fed. That is, either by food supplied by the planter or by the enslaved themselves. An analysis of historical sources suggests that unreliable and unstable distributions of food rations forced enslaved laborers to actively participate and ultimately control their own subsistence practices for survival, particularly through the use and management of kitchen gardens just outside the domestic slave dwellings to grow fruit trees, herbs, leafy vegetables, as well as the maintenance of large provision grounds. Now, to be clear, food for the enslaved Africans was insufficient for several reasons. There were threats of famine. That was constant throughout the colonial era. Environmental factors such as hurricanes negatively affected food production to supply the enslaved population. And deliveries of certain provisions such as salted fish and meat and grain by cargo ships were often irregular and unpredictable. Therefore, if naval imports could safely arrive, and if the planter allowed it, the enslaved laborers would occasionally receive servings of salted fish and beef to supplement this starchy diet. Now, I stress the word if for the worst reason of all, and that was the basic neglect on the part of plantation owners. On the one hand, you had a battle between the French administration and slaveholders. The French government interceded by establishing the Code Noir, that means the Black Code, in the last decades of the 17th century. And subsequent local ordinances required planters to supplement the slave provisions, but to little effect. In their chronicles, travelers went so far as to say that slavers exhibited a destructive stinginess that left the enslaved community constantly undernourished. Planters chose to concentrate on planting sugarcane for export and neglecting suitable space on their lands for foodstuffs to feed their enslaved laborers. Thus, food was also a struggle between planters and the enslaved. And this dilemma over nourishment remained so throughout the 18th century and well into the 19th century until emancipation, which was around 1848. Now, while it's certain that slave foodways went through various changes throughout the colonial era, its nuances may not have been observed by European travelers. French colonists, travelers, and visiting officials viewed slave food not only as inadequate, but also as monotonous. And since the mid to late 17th century, French colonists and the colonial government made note of slave meals often characterized as one-pot stews, sometimes called Creole ragouts, and were described as a strange hodgepodge of meat or salted fish, heavily seasoned with hot chili peppers. However, one cannot overstate how European observers and the French planter class viewed slave food as markedly different and substandard from their own, stressing that the core of the slave diet was minimal, stodgy, and with little animal protein. This racialized appraisal of culinary value placed onto the slave diet was yet another marker that fixed the enslaved community's subordinate and marginalized status within the colonial hierarchy. To help broaden my understanding of slave foodways, I looked to other lines of evidence, including doing archaeological investigations at a sugar plantation in Guadeloupe called La Mordière. And plantations in the French Caribbean were called habitation, like habitation. Named for the original estate proprietor, that was Etienne Douillard Mordière, the property was established as early as 1732. And over the next decades, it evolved into a very prosperous and relatively large-scale sugar plantation, fluctuating between 100 to 200 enslaved field laborers and an on-site sugar works that they call sucrerie. And just so you have an idea of what it looks like today, which you can go and visit if you ever go to Guadeloupe, and trust me, you should. It is one of the most beautiful places that no one ever talks about. The French are very good at keeping that secret. But you can go and see a lot of these places. So for my work, I studied the material culture, including faunal remains that we recovered from the slave village at Habitation La Mordière for zoological data coupled with primary sources and secondary literature so that it could provide me with an alternative narrative of slave diet that's often misinformed as part of a public memory that, again, is this homogeneous, stodgy diet made of the planters' scraps with little appetizing appeal. Instead, I stressed that Black foodways was a form of culinary resistance to this arena of multiple conflicts for alimentation, but also as a consideration for identity formation practices under an institution of racialized terror. Over several seasons of excavation, we recovered a bevy of locally produced and imported material culture, especially ceramics, associated with different activities, which of course included foodways. Now, I will apologize for just the time. I just wanted to demonstrate I did go and excavate and found all these artifacts and put it in tables, and it makes sense to archaeologists. But if you read it, you'd see it bigger. But there's my evidence. Okay. So the faunal assemblage that you can barely see here represents about 30 taxa of wild and domestic species and suggests that the plantation laborers during slavery and even afterwards relied on a variety of marine and terrestrial sources for animal protein. For the slavery era, we found evidence for some beef, but mostly pork consumption, along with butchery marks on bones and the recovery of numerous bowl sherds and potsherds that were indicative of stewed meals. As I stated before, the popularity of one-pot meals such as kalalu, cooked by Black women, was evident in the mid-17th century, if not earlier, by French witnesses, and it remains a culinary tradition today. Now, what I found most interesting was the evidence of intense shellfish consumption. Marine invertebrates provided an abundant source of meat, contributing to just over 50% of the total edible meat for the faunal assemblage of the slavery period. And so this is where they were getting the vast majority of the meat that they needed or wanted. The significant presence of shellfish taxa in the laborers' consumption patterns served as a response and a supplement to the insufficient amount of beef and pork in their diets. If they lacked access to terrestrial meat, then enslaved laborers aggressively sought out marine-based meat, especially whelks, what we called West Indian topshell. This is a species that inhabits rocky shores and intertidal zones. And with regards to La Mordière, this is not surprising considering the plantation. It lies only about 2.2 kilometers or 1.37 miles to the west of the island's coastline. Thus, the enslaved community took full advantage to gather as much shellfish to not only supplement their nutritional needs, but also to diversify the tastes and textures of their meals, an opportunity that wasn't necessarily available for others on plantations that were too far away from the coastline or major waterways. Because slave foodways operated within an arena of multiple conflicts, I conceptualize these subsistence practices as culinary resistance. Foodways may act as a marker of identity, and as a cultural practice, it occurs every single day. And more importantly, it's replete with symbols and meanings associated with social power. So it's a fancy way of saying you are what you eat. My conceptualizing of slave foodways and identity was heavily influenced by a Black feminist approach of intersectionality, this framework to study the fusions of modes of oppression, that is, race and gender and status as enslaved. And being able to use this type of intersectionality as a theory allowed me to provide greater gender inclusivity to explore the different ways of self-making that validated women's experiences. Therefore, if you are what you eat, then who makes what you eat has a direct influence on who you are. And that was these women. Using a Black feminist approach helped me to identify potential examples of how women's agency, resistance, and Creole identity formation were negotiated within the context of slavery. These women were relegated to the most subordinate position within colonial society, and yet created a cuisine born out of slave foodways, a complex culinary form of everyday resistance that went beyond the struggle for general sustenance under an institution of racialized terror and nutritional neglect, to provide a culinary satisfaction to their meals and form the basis of what would become a Creole identity. Enslaved women exercised their daily culinary skills and ingenuity to create a vernacular aesthetic, a distinct new food system which integrated West African, European, and New World foodstuffs and culinary techniques into what is known contemporarily as Creole cuisine in the Caribbean. So, you're still with me? We're going to shift to a whole different part of the Caribbean now. Good, all right. This next section features, how should I put it? It's the work that I'm developing into a new journal article. And I've chosen, for good or bad, a moment in my research and writing process. And with that comes a vulnerability, so please be kind. Moving from the French Caribbean to the British, I'll now discuss my work on how freed women of color on St. Vincent Island in the Grenadines performed acts of resistance and accommodation while actively looking for family cohesion, societal ascension, and economic independence between 1763 and 1808. I'll briefly contextualize social and economic parameters of St. Vincent as a recent acquisition to British plantation islands. And this was characterized at the time as what they would call the sugar frontier. Like, it wasn't like Jamaica or Barbados that fully embraced plantation, the sugar economy in the same way. St. Vincent started out much slower in that kind of economy before the British arrived. I assert that plantation economies created opportunities for free women of color to become economically independent and financially successful while simultaneously trapping them into performing and perpetuating racialized subjugation and exploitation of enslaved Africans. And so I'm going to highlight 5 free women of color: Ann Adams, Grace Richards, Mary Mitchell, Penelope Brown, and Geneviève Coquinas, as a study of the complexity of Black women's agency as they subverted a racist and sexist colonial society to manipulate the rules of the plantation economy for financial independence and success. Now, when I say free people of color for the purposes of this paper or this presentation, this already includes racially mixed, as well as those with no white or European parentage. Free people of color held a precarious position in colonial island society. Although they were legally free and often associated by familial ties with upper classes, white racial solidarity took precedence over class and status. Free people of color were denied any political participation and could not be admitted into the ruling class. Thus, upward mobility or societal ascension within the Caribbean plantation economy precludes any racial equity and political participation of non-whites. And so it had to be based on economics. Let me provide a very brief background of St. Vincent. So before 1763, the archipelago of St. Vincent, that is what we call St. Vincent and the Grenadines, it was a possession of France. Island demographics was comprised of Black indigenous, they were once called the Caribs. This was a complex, racial and ethnically diverse indigenous population. You also had French settlers from Martinique, you had free people of color, and you had the enslaved African population. As was the case throughout the Caribbean, free people of color held a very unique but liminal status in colonial society. While associated structures of white supremacy and economic dominance by European powers was central, the French that occupied St. Vincent, the racial, social interactions were not as overly restrictive as you would see in British islands. Thus, free people of color, that population grew rather quickly and exercised a relatively higher standard of social and legal freedom in comparison to British colonial islands. But at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, Britain acquired St. Vincent along with other seceded islands like Trinidad and St. Lucia. And so they sought to entice potential land buyers from various parts of Britain and the British Caribbean to the archipelago to launch a plantation economy based on sugarcane agriculture. Even with the combination of the original French settlers and the British immigrants, white people were still outnumbered by the non-white population. And the relatively low white population was exacerbated by a gender imbalance as fewer white women immigrated to the seceded islands. During Britain's expansion of its plantation economy, the population of free people of color continued to grow, but certainly under harsher rules for non-whites. And there was a continuous advocacy for the separation of races. Mrs. Carmichael, an upper-class Scotswoman who authored 2 books about her travels in the early 19th century, blamed colored women for ruthlessly enticing white men into relationships. She also stated that St. Vincent's decent society thought it was in poor taste to keep their biracial children in bondage. However, they were not viewed as equal members of the white families either. And on many of the Windward Islands, opportunities for societal mobility for non-whites, again, were severely limited, if not made impossible. So, for example, on St. Vincent, free non-whites were declared ineligible to own more than 8 acres of land so that they wouldn't be in competition with plantation owners. Economic independence would not arrive through the ownership of large farms or the cultivation and exportation of cash crops, especially for non-white women. Therefore, to fully consider the ways in which free women of color in St. Vincent negotiated their limiting positions in colonial society, I'm reconceptualizing the plantation economy outside the rural sector and focusing on a social economy of the urban sector through slaving practices. Mrs. Carmichael was keenly aware of this and had her own opinion. As I defined it, St. Vincent's social economy of non-whites, particularly centered on women of color, this was a dynamic set of financial and interpersonal activities that they used to contest and subvert societal stratification and exercise economic independence to achieve upward mobility, especially in St. Vincent's largest town, which was Kingstown, and still is Kingstown. Now, in contrast, free men of color were often trained to become blacksmiths, coopers, and enter other skill-based occupations and establish stable sources of income in towns and cities, even if they couldn't be invited into the best of society. Free women of color were not afforded specialized occupation beyond positions as seamstress or even market women. But what the plantation economy not only allowed, but promoted was financial success through the participation in chattel slavery by anyone considered legally free, even Black people. While there were, notable exceptions, such as Marissa J. Fuentes' study of Rachel Pringle Polgreen, that's the larger woman of Barbados, or Carlin Sundback's recent work on free women of color in the Danish-Norwegian West Indies, it appears that the history of women of color slavers has fallen out of public memory, despite how these women statistically dominated urban slave settings. Of the seceded islands, historians such as David Alston and Cassandra Pybus and Kit Calden have highlighted some of the wealthier slavers, such as Dorothy Thomas of Demerara, the other woman that you see, and Susan Osterham in Grenada. However, it seems that most of these free women of color slaveholders during the late 18th century never held more than a handful of enslaved laborers, usually 1 to 3. And based on what I've uncovered so far, this participation in chattel slavery was for, it was about the economic instability and how to circumvent these severely limited choices of employment that free women were allowed. Without economic independence or financial security of marriage, particularly with a specialized skillsman or tradesman, women of color were in danger of falling into a life of squalor or forced back into enslavement or punished or pushed into a life of prostitution. So for some free women of color, slaveholding was an opportunity to create generational wealth, as it was for so many whites. My work hopes to build on the aforementioned scholars' intersectional analyses of race and gender, again through a Black feminist lens, in what Marissa Fuentes states as a process to destabilize the power of dominant knowledge and representations of women of the African diaspora. Free women of color took advantage of such economic opportunities by a variety of means for multiple reasons. However, as I've said, I will only be addressing 5 women, therefore 5 different ways that they did so, that I've located in the archives this far. One of the first sets of questions that I started thinking about was, well, how did free women of color begin to participate as slaveholders on St. Vincent? So there's evidence that women of color were purchasing as early as 1774, if not earlier. I found an August 20th, 1774 record of a huckster, that is a market woman, named Anne Adams, who purchased an enslaved woman named Clarissa and her child Betty from a William Fiddler, a carpenter. And I believe that Anne Adams may have been a free woman for various reasons. Historians such as Melanie Newton suggest that hucksters were usually enslaved women, although some were free and often accumulated wealth. More importantly, in some of the St. Vincent marriage and baptism and burial records, I found that Anne Gozelling Adams was identified as a mulatto woman and baptized in 1773. And a few years later, this Anne Adams is now identified as a free Negro who had Dorothy, a Negro child, listed as her property and baptized in 1778. In other situations, slaveholding by free women of color exemplified the complexity of personal interactions and individual or community conceptions of family within this social economy. Let's take the case of Grace Richards. She was labeled as a free woman and purchased a child named Betty, a girl named Sophia, and another girl named Grace over the course of the first 5 months of 1780. Firstly, there was this transaction between a Robert and Isabel Laurie, who sold to Grace, the free Negro, as she was known. They sold a child named Betty for only 21 pounds. The next record I found was a receipt citing payment for the enslaved girl named Sophia. But what's interesting about this is that it was witnessed by a white planter and slaver named Josiah Durham. And a few months later, I found another receipt or a sale or a promise that Josiah Durham would purchase for Grace a Negro girl for the sum of about 14 joes, which accumulates to about 84 pounds. These transactions become even more complicated when I found that Josiah sired and baptized a mulatto girl named Charlotte by an enslaved woman named Sophie, owned by Durham. It's my guess that Sophie and Sophia, mentioned 3 years earlier, are the same person, is the same person. As to why Grace chose to purchase Sophia, the reasons may be an entanglement beyond my understanding, for at least the moment, because I also uncovered in Grace's will that was lodged in around 1800 that it became clear that Grace and Josiah had a sexual relationship. Her will states that Grace's son, Josiah Durham the Younger, was fathered by Josiah Durham the Elder. And in the context of a slave patriarchal society where sexual violence was used for control and punishment and could ultimately financially benefit white men, free women of color's sexual agency as a tool for power is difficult to assess. But it seems that her personal and business links with Durham the Elder suggest that not all miscegenated relationships were superficial or transient. For Grace, perhaps, her relationship with Durham was amicable, at minimum. For both father and son, Durham were named the executors of her will. What it also reveals is that near the time of her death, she also had at least 2 enslaved men, Peter and Cy, that were also her brothers. Although I suspect she owned legally her brothers as a manner to keep them protected from white slavers, because upon her death, they were meant to be set free, manumitted. All right, Mary Mitchell. I came across a woman slaver named Mary Mitchell through purchase transactions of enslaved people in the last quarter of the 18th century. It is difficult at first to even establish if she was a person of color, because it appears that in transactions that she initiated, she never chose to identify her race or skin color. However, in a 1787 declaration of trust by William Richardson, a British ship carpenter leaving her land identifies her as musty, or a person who is of mixed race, most likely only having a quarter or even an eighth of African ancestry. Her racial marker was again confirmed with her burial record in 1801 as a woman of color. But in her will, she never indicates her racial category. And I wonder if this had to do with the conflation of skin color. Probably she was quite fair if she was only 1/8 Black. And so she had to be listed as musty or colored, but her status as a slaver certainly must have influenced her to elude the restrictions of race and class, at least for her own sense of identity. But what's also surprising is that her burial record states that her alias surname was Richardson. Remember I mentioned Richardson before? There's a connection. Indeed, in her will, she bequeaths possessions, including enslaved people and money to who I believe are to be her sons, a David Richardson living in the city of London as a saddler, and an Alexander Richardson who stayed in St. Vincent. No race is indicated for either of the men. More than likely, her sons passed as white. And she chose to not expose them to social and political danger by stating her own parentage, which could easily be traced if someone wanted to take the time to do so and find out that she did have African ancestry. So if she does, no matter how fair she looks or her children look, then they would still be considered Black, even if they literally could pass as white. This case of Mary Mitchell leads to more questions. Where does she fit in the narrative of dynamics between women of color and white men in the context of a sexual economy in the urban slave society? That's just one of these questions. I'm working on the rest. I turn to Penelope Brown, whose sexual relationship with a white man certainly benefited her financially, but it appears to be a little bit less ambiguous. I first encountered Penelope Brown in the deed book of St. Vincent for 1798, and it appears that Miss Brown became a slaveholder by being gifted an enslaved person. A transaction lodged in 1798 shows that French-Belgian planter Benjamin Van Loo gifts a free Black woman, Penelope Brown, for, quote, in consideration of good behavior he received for a long time, unquote. He gifted her a Negro woman named Juliet. And so I wondered, okay, if she's free, could she have been employed? Could Penelope Brown have been employed in some capacity by Monsieur Van Loo? Answers would come in a couple of pages. In another transaction called a deed gift dated the same date as the previous, it says, in consideration of the affection I have for my daughter, Elizabeth Van Loo, child of Penelope Brown, a Negro woman slave named Cuba. So he gifts her his daughter, Elizabeth, with enslaved Blacks to elevate their status and make them economically independent in this social economy in the Caribbean. This appears to be a consensual, sexual relationship between Benjamin Van Loo and Penelope Brown, but also because this financial security and economic independence was secured and extended to all of the Van Loo children. More came, there were more children. I started to see all of this playing out in deed polls, where Benjamin Van Loo bequeaths land to his children that included Benjamin, John, Elizabeth, Sarah, Richard. They were busy. They were a little busy. This financial security, rooted in the acceptance of the rules of a plantation economy, allowed Penelope Brown and her children to live at the highest status within the island's social economy, even if it was meant to limit their ability to reach social equity. As it turns out, Elizabeth, Sarah, and Richard, at least 3 of Benjamin and Penelope's 5 children, were also slaveholders, never holding more than 10. The economic success resulted in entry into a new middle-class status, even if it was racialized. Penelope Brown and women like her were able to create enough capital through slaving to orchestrate access to higher levels of education in Britain or via private tutelage in the Caribbean for their children and grandchildren. Their male progeny established careers as skilled tradesmen, civil servants, and merchants. And in many cases, the practice of miscegenation along family lines obscured their Black lineage and allowed more than a few of their descendants to penetrate British society, again, by passing as white. Through the enterprising labor of these women, this Black middle class afforded some privileges for their children and grandchildren that, as I've stated, included more enslaved Blacks as inheritable property. And furthermore, while their offsprings were free and wealthy, they were still forced to adhere to the political constraints of a plantation economy and therefore were without citizen status. And in response, men of color, since women were completely excluded from the privilege of protest parity, many of these men lobbied to expand their battles for equity and equality against the culling of their rights during the last decades of the slavery era and afterwards. They launched lots of petitions to the British government. So, for example, I was able to find this petition by the colored people of St. Vincent from the 1820s, and it's housed at the National Archives at Kew. And some of the signees include descendants of Penelope Brown's children, who fought to achieve the same political rights, fair treatment, and economic opportunities always enjoyed by their white counterparts through such petitions and forms of civil protest. And by fair treatment, that also meant that it included for applying for compensation from the British government after slavery finally ended. Interestingly enough, my evidence for the Van Loo children's slaveholding practices came from claimant records at UCL's Legacies of British Slave Ownership database. So that means that even they applied and successfully received compensation when slavery ended. Moreover, none of these records detail the Van Loo's racial background. My last example, Geneviève Coquinlas. The spelling for her name remains insecure throughout the archives. And the 1806 burial records state that she was a baker, and etc. But it belies her impressive position in island society. Excavation of archival records suggests that Madame Coquinlas was an extraordinarily successful businesswoman who maintained business and familial relationships of island inhabitants of French and British descent. She was a slaveholder, a property owner with personal and professional connections to prominent Scottish men such as William Alexander, who was the paymaster general in the East India Company and the owner of Ballochmyle, I hope I pronounced that right, Ballochmyle House. She also had relationships with Robert Paul, who was the president of His Majesty's Council and commander-in-chief in and over the islands of St. Vincent, Bequia, and the rest of the Grenadines. And although I have yet to understand the genesis of her business acumen for the moment, the earliest record or recorded transactions that I found date back to around 1792. Demonstrating how Madame Coquinlas participated in internal island slave trade with prominent sugar planters, colonial administrators, and politicians that include Sir William Young the second baronet governor of Tobago, and owner of several estates, including 2 on St. Vincent. While most Black slavers never amassed more than 2 or 3 enslaved Africans, Madame Coquillas appears to have been part of a different class alongside contemporaries such as Dorothy Thomas of Demerara. Those women amassed significant wealth, connections, and influence that allotted them a unique privilege to traverse the frontier Caribbean spaces, to establish new and further old businesses, as well as overseas travel to the UK to manage personal relationships and oversee marital unions with socially and fiscally responsible white families. Unfortunately, this is where I'm going to conclude my presentation. The few examples I've provided today illustrate a potential bounty of dynamic narratives of free women of color as slavers. These women negotiated their limiting position in colonial society by manipulating the culture sphere of an expanded plantation economy within an imperially insecure frontier landscape for social mobility and economic independence through the ownership of enslaved people. It would be too easy, and more importantly, wrong, to narrow one's interpretation to state that given the opportunity, regardless of morality, anyone would have participated in the brutal enslavement of Africans. The design of the plantation economy, interlinked with white patriarchy, severely limited and marginalized Black women's ability to gain social ascension and economic stability and freedom. And of course, political rights were null. The only loophole was the right to own and exploit Black bodies. These women were able to establish their own definition of personhood, and while subverting the limits of colonial society, I stress again that the subversion was simultaneously performed with an accommodation for racism. Ultimately, the social mobility, economic independence, and success required them to participate and even justify an anti-Black system of racialized violence and horrific human exploitation for profit. The strategies to acquire slaveholding practices are complex and varied, of which I've only highlighted a few, but with further study, I have no doubt that there is a rich and nuanced social history to recover. I appreciate your patience and attendance, and of course, any helpful critique that you may have could strengthen this potential journal article. So, thank you.